I walked into his mistress's baby shower, smiling, hiding the DNA results in a pastel envelope. She opened it, went pale, and screamed, "Landon! What did you do?" His mother dropped her glass as I just smoothed my dress and said, "Checkmate. Before I tell you how I burned their empire to the ground, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community." The scream was still echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the Legacy estate when I turned around. It was a beautiful sound, sharp and terrified, the exact frequency of a life shattering into a million pieces. Olivia, the girl who had spent the last 6 months treating me like her personal contractor, was clutching her stomach, looking at the document in her hands as if it were radioactive. My mother-in-law, Catherine, was staring at the shards of crystal on the floor, her face draining of color until she looked like one of the marble statues in the garden. And my husband? Brandon? He looked like a man who had just realized the floor beneath him was actually a trap door. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel angry. I felt precise. Like a surgeon who had just completed a difficult incision. I checked my watch. 2:14 in the afternoon. Perfect timing. The sun was streaming through the windows I had designed, lighting up the ruin I had orchestrated. This wasn't just a reveal. It was an eviction notice. And I had signed it in ink that wouldn't fade. To understand how the bomb went off, you have to understand how I built it. We need to go back 72 hours. Monday morning. The air in Napa Valley usually smells of fermentation and wet earth. But inside the east wing of the Legacy estate, it smelled like expensive lavender cleaning spray and fresh paint. I was standing on a ladder, adjusting a silk canopy over a crib that cost more than most people's cars. Tears serve no structural purpose, so I didn't shed any. My hands remained steady because stability is the first rule of architecture. I understand load-bearing walls, and I understand that if you remove the wrong beam, the whole house comes down. My mother-in-law, Catherine, walked in. Her heels clicked on the hardwood floors I had selected 3 years ago. She didn't look at me. She looked at the floral arrangements. She frowned, reaching out to pluck a slightly wilted petal from a white rose. She told me the arrangement looked tired. She told me that for the nursery reveal, everything had to be crisp. It had to signal vitality. She reminded me that the brand was about legacy, and that Olivia represented the new chapter. She said it without a hint of irony, asking the wife to decorate the sanctuary for the mistress. I know what you're thinking. Why was I there? Why was I hanging drapes for the woman sleeping with my husband? Why didn't I burn the house down right then and there? That brings me to something I call the art of playing dead. In nature, when a prey animal realizes it cannot outrun a predator, it freezes. It stops breathing. It goes limp. It's a survival mechanism. But in a marriage like this, it is a tactical weapon. For the last 6 months, I had engaged in a campaign of strategic submission. When Brandon told me about the baby, I didn't scream. I didn't throw a vase. I went quiet. When Catherine told me I needed to be mature and support the lineage, I nodded. I let them believe I was broken. I let them believe I was desperate to stay in their orbit, terrified of losing the prestige of the vineyard name. And it worked. It worked perfectly. Because when you play dead, the predator stops watching you. They get sloppy. They stop whispering. They leave their phones unlocked on the kitchen island. They leave the safe door ajar because they think there is no one around to look inside. They leave financial statements on the desk because they assume the grieving wife is too emotional to read the fine print. My compliance wasn't weakness. It was camouflage. By agreeing to design the nursery, I wasn't serving them. I was gaining access. I had the keys to every room. I had the security codes. I had hours alone in the house while they were out celebrating their new chapter. They thought I was hanging wallpaper. I was installing wiretaps in the form of forensic accounting. Catherine finished critiquing the flowers and turned to me. She smiled, that tight, practiced smile she used for donors and tourists. She told me I was being very sensible. She said that presentation was everything. I looked her dead in the eye and agreed. Presentation is everything. and I was preparing to present them with a reality they could never edit out. To understand why I didn't feel guilty about what was coming, you have to understand the economy of our marriage. I wasn't just a wife. I was a resource they had strip-mined for 5 years. When I met Brandon, I was already making a name for myself. I was 27, an interior architect with a portfolio full of minimalist coastal homes and high-end retail spaces. I understood flow. I understood light. I understood how to take a space that felt dead and make it breathe. The legacy estate was dying when I arrived. The vines were old, the main house was a drafty museum of bad 80s renovations, and the brand was fading. Brandon told me he had a vision. He told me we were going to build something modern, something that honored the land but spoke to a new generation. I believed him. I poured everything I had into this place. I redesigned the tasting room, turning it from a dark cave into a glass-walled sanctuary that doubled their foot traffic in 6 months. I renovated the guest cottages, creating a luxury retreat that booked out a year in advance. And how did they thank me? They treated me like a contractor they forgot to pay. Thomas, my father-in-law, called me creative help in front of investors. Catherine introduced me at parties as Brandon's wife. She does a little decorating. A little decorating. I had tripled the value of their property. I had created the very aesthetic they used to sell $60 bottles of Cabernet. But to them, my talent wasn't a gift. It was a utility, like electricity or running water. You don't thank the light switch for working, you just flip it on. But the disrespect wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the money. Brandon liked to play the part of the tech investor, the visionary heir. He drove cars he leased and wore watches he bought on credit. He talked big game about diversifying the portfolio. But the truth was simpler and uglier. He was broke. The vineyard was leveraged to the hilt. His tech investments had evaporated 2 years ago. For the last 3 years, I had been the one quietly plugging the holes in the sinking ship. When the payroll account ran low, I transferred money from my design fees. When the roof on the processing facility needed replacing, I used a chunk of the inheritance my grandmother left me. I never asked for it back. I thought we were partners. I thought we were building a life. 6 months ago, Brandon came to me in a panic. He said a major deal had fallen through. He needed liquidity, fast, or they were going to miss a loan covenant. He asked me to sign over access to my trust. I refused. That was the first time I saw the mask slip. He looked at me with such disdain, such entitlement. He told me I didn't understand finance. He told me I should stick to picking paint colors. That was the moment the love died. Not when I found out about Olivia, not when I saw the texts. It was the moment I realized he didn't see me as a partner, he saw me as a line of credit, and now he was trying to replace me with a newer, flashier model, assuming I would just fade into the background, grateful for the scraps. He had no idea that the help was actually the one holding the mortgage. He had no idea that the financial backbone he was trying to break was the only thing keeping his world standing. The heat in Napa is deceptive. It starts as a gentle warmth on your skin, a golden haze that makes everything look romantic, but by mid-afternoon, it's oppressive. A weight that settles in your lungs. Thursday was like that, the day of the party setup. The estate was buzzing with vendors, florists, and catering staff, all moving in a synchronized dance I was conducting. Then Olivia arrived. She didn't drive herself. She arrived in a hired car, stepping out like she was walking a red carpet. She was wearing white linen, impractical for a vineyard, but perfect for Instagram. She walked into the East Wing, phone held high, recording everything. She chirped to her invisible audience about her dream life manifesting. She spotted me near the window, checking the hem of the curtains. She walked over, not to say hello, but to inspect. She ran a hand over the crib sheet. She wrinkled her nose and asked if it was Egyptian cotton because it felt rough. She told me Brandon promised her the best. She looked at me then, really looked at me, with the kind of pity you reserve for a stray dog. She asked me to double-check the order because she wanted him to be comfortable. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to tell her that the best was currently being paid for by the woman standing in front of her. Instead, I just nodded. I told her I would check the invoice. My voice was calm. It was the voice of someone who knew exactly what the invoice said and exactly whose account it had been paid from. Later, Catherine found me in the garden. She pulled me aside, her grip on my arm tight enough to bruise. She told me I needed to look happier. She said people were going to be watching and that if I looked miserable, it reflected poorly on the family. She claimed they were modern and handling this with grace. I asked her if that's what we were calling it, grace. She snapped back that they were calling it survival. She said Brandon needed this child. The trust required an heir. I couldn't provide one. Olivia could. She called it a business arrangement. A business arrangement. That's when it clicked. They were asset rich, but cash poor. They had the land, the brand, the history, but they didn't have the liquidity to keep the lights on. They were drowning in debt, living on credit and reputation. And here I was, the help, standing on a foundation of liquid assets they could only dream of. They were wearing Rolexes they hadn't paid off. I was wearing a Casio and sitting on a 7-figure trust fund they had failed to access. Brandon found me an hour later. He was drinking scotch at 2 in the afternoon. He cornered me in the library, the room smelling of old leather and his expensive cologne. He warned me not to think about making a scene on Saturday. He reminded me that the morality clause in the trust was clear. If I embarrassed the family, if I caused a public scandal, I would get nothing. I would walk away with zero. He thought he was holding a gun to my head. He didn't realize I had already emptied the chamber. He didn't know that the morality clause worked both ways, or that I had spent the last 3 nights reading the trust documents with a magnifying glass. I looked him in the eye and told him I wouldn't make a scene. I told him I was just going to give Olivia her gift. He relaxed, taking another sip of his drink. He said that was good. He said we should just get through it for the brand. I echoed him. I watched him walk away. Confident, arrogant, completely unaware that he was standing on a trapdoor I had just unlatched. He saw a wife who was afraid of losing her lifestyle. I saw a man who was already bankrupt. He just hadn't checked his balance yet. The week leading up to the reveal was a masterclass in professional detachment. I treated the destruction of my marriage like I treated any other high-stakes project. With meticulous planning, rigorous documentation, and zero emotion. I wasn't a wife snooping through a husband's phone. I was an auditor conducting a forensic investigation, and because I was designing the new wing, I had legitimate access to every corner of the house, including the home office Brandon kept locked. He thought he was clever. He kept the sensitive documents in a safe behind a painting, a cliché so tired it was almost insulting. But he forgot one thing. I designed the office. I knew the safe combination because it was the date we broke ground on the tasting room. He was sentimental about his empire, even as he was betraying the person who built it. Wednesday night, while Brandon was at a client dinner, which my GPS tracker confirmed was actually Olivia's apartment complex, I opened the safe. It was all there. The loan documents he had forged my signature on. The emails to his lawyer trying to find loopholes in the prenup. And, tucked in a manila folder at the back, the DNA test he had known for 3 weeks. The test was dated a month ago. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. He had looked me in the eye every day for 3 weeks, eaten the dinner I cooked, and slept in the bed I made, all while knowing he had created a child with another woman. He wasn't confused. He wasn't conflicted. He was just waiting for the right moment to discard me. I took photos of everything. High resolution, time-stamped, undeniable. Then I put everything back exactly as I found it. I didn't want him to know he had been breached. I wanted him to feel safe. I wanted him to walk into that party feeling invincible. Thursday was dedicated to the gift. I went to a rare book dealer in San Francisco and bought a leather-bound journal. It was beautiful hand-stitched Italian leather, heavy cream paper. On the cover, I had them emboss baby's first year in gold leaf. It looked like an heirloom. It looked like love. I spent Friday assembling the contents. I didn't just shove papers in an envelope. I curated it. Page 1 was the ultrasound photo I had found in his desk. I mounted it carefully, using archival tape. Page 2 was the DNA test result, highlighted in neon yellow. Page 3 was the foreclosure notice I had intercepted from the mail a week earlier, the one Brandon thought he had successfully hidden. Page 4 was a printout of the loan agreement for the shell company Phoenix Ventures, the company that had saved the vineyard 6 months ago, the company that listed me, Taylor, as the sole proprietor. I wrapped the book in vintage floral paper. I tied it with a silk ribbon in the exact shade of sage green Olivia had chosen for the nursery walls. The package was perfect. It was elegant, thoughtful, and absolutely lethal. It sat on my desk, a beautiful, silent bomb, waiting for its detonator. I looked at it and felt a strange sense of calm. For 5 years, I had built things for them. I had built their brand, their homes, their reputation. I had used my creativity to make them look better, richer, and happier than they actually were. Now, for the first time, I was using my skills to dismantle it all. I was designing their ruin, and it was going to be my masterpiece. Saturday afternoon. The East Wing was bathed in that specific, expensive golden light that only seems to exist in Napa Valley promotional brochures. The Sip and See was in full swing. 50 of the region's most influential people were drinking vintage sparkling wine, cooing over the hand-painted mural I had commissioned, and congratulating Brandon on his new chapter. Catherine was holding court near the bassinet, telling a group of investors that the baby was the future of the legacy. Olivia was sitting in a velvet armchair, radiant in white lace, looking every inch the adored mother-to-be. She was basking in it, the attention, the validation, the triumph of having replaced me. I waited until the lull. That moment in a party when the first round of drinks is done and everyone is looking for a focal point. I stepped into the center of the room. I didn't tap a glass. I didn't need to. I just stood there, holding the leather-bound book with both hands, perfectly still. The silence rippled outward from me until the whole room was quiet. I told them I had one last gift. For the new mother. Olivia smiled. That pitying, benevolent smile she reserved for me. She told me I didn't have to. I told her I really did. I walked over and handed her the book. She ran her fingers over the gold lettering on the cover. She read the title aloud. She showed everyone, calling it an heirloom. She opened the cover. The room leaned in. She saw page 1 and was delighted by the ultrasound picture. There was a collective awe from the crowd. Catherine beamed, looking at me with a nod of approval. She thought I had fallen in line. She thought I was playing the gracious loser. Olivia turned the heavy cream paper to page 2. The smile froze. It didn't fade. It just stopped, like a video buffered mid-frame. She stared at the page. She blinked. Then she looked up at Brandon, confusion warping into panic. She whispered a question, asking what it was. I told her gently to read it. That it was part of the family history. She read it aloud, her voice shaking. Probability of paternity. 99.99%. Alleged father. Brandon Pierce. The room went dead. It was a vacuum. The air was sucked out instantly. Brandon dropped his glass. It didn't shatter. It bounced on the rug with a dull thud, spilling red wine like a bloodstain. Brandon lunged forward, his face turning a violent shade of red. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing and tried to grab the book. I stepped between them. I wasn't the wife anymore. I was the architect of his ruin. I told him I wasn't done. I told Olivia to turn to page 4. Catherine shrieked, rushing forward, claiming it was a private matter and ordering everyone out. I told them no one was going anywhere. I reached into the back of the book and pulled out the folded document I had hidden there. I held it up. It wasn't sentimental. It was a legal contract. I addressed the room. I reminded them that 6 months ago, the vineyard was saved by a last-minute infusion of capital from an anonymous angel investor called Phoenix Ventures. I reminded them how they had all toasted to Brandon's business acumen. I looked at Brandon. He was staring at the document in my hand, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrific realization. I told him that Phoenix Ventures wasn't a firm in Silicon Valley. I told him it was a shell company, registered to me. The gasp that went through the room was louder than the one for the DNA test. In this crowd, infidelity was a scandal, but financial fraud was a death sentence. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I was the angel investor. I told him I bought his debt. I owned the note on this estate. And the loan agreement had a very specific clause about the misappropriation of funds. I pointed to the nursery, to the crib, to the silk drapes. I told him he used company capital, my capital, to build a nursery for his mistress. That is fraud. That is embezzlement. And as of this morning, I have declared the loan in default. Brandon staggered back, looking like he had been physically struck. He stammered, realizing I was Phoenix. I smoothed the cover of the book. I told him I wasn't his wife. I was his primary creditor, and he had just broken the terms of his contract. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that usually precedes a structural collapse. The guests, 50 of Napa's elite, were frozen, glasses hovering halfway to their mouths, witnessing the public execution of a dynasty. Thomas, my father-in-law, broke the tableau. He had been standing by the window, silent as usual, but now he moved. He walked into the center of the room, his boots heavy on the floor. He didn't look at his son. He didn't look at his wife. He held out his hand to me. I handed him the loan agreement. He put on his reading glasses and scanned the document. He didn't read it like a father. He read it like a man who understands that land is the only thing that matters. He flipped to the foreclosure notice. He saw the signatures. He saw the numbers. Catherine finally broke her paralysis. She rushed to his side, grabbing his arm, shrieking for him to do something. She claimed I was lying, that I was hysterical. She insisted they could fix it. Thomas didn't look up. He told Catherine to shut up. The command was quiet, but it snapped like a whip. Catherine recoiled as if slapped. Thomas looked at Brandon. His face was unreadable, a mask of weathered stone. He asked if Brandon had leveraged the East Wing against a private loan. Brandon stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. He claimed it was a bridge loan to cover the tech losses. He said he was going to pay it back once the harvest came in. He said he just needed liquidity. Thomas gestured around the room, at the silk drapes, the mural, the ridiculous extravagance of the nursery. He asked if Brandon used operating capital for personal vanity. Brandon pleaded that it was for the heir, for the legacy. Thomas threw the papers onto the floor. He said that wasn't legacy, it was embezzlement. He turned to me. For the first time in 5 years, he didn't look past me. He looked right at me. There was no warmth in his eyes, but there was something else. Recognition. He realized I wasn't the help. He asked if the default clause triggered immediate repayment. I confirmed it. In full. Plus penalties. Or I took title to the land. Brandon fell to his knees. It was pathetic. He reached for my hand but stopped short when he saw the look on my face. He begged me, saying we were partners, that we were married, that we were family. I looked down at him. I looked at the man who had slept in my bed while planning a nursery for another woman. I looked at the mother-in-law who had called me staff. I looked at the mistress clutching a paternity test like it was a death certificate. I told him I wasn't family. My voice was ice. I told him I was the creditor, and I was foreclosing. Thomas nodded slowly. He understood. It was business. He told Brandon he was out. Removed from the board. Effective immediately. He said he wouldn't let Brandon drag the rest of the estate down with his stupidity. Brandon cried out. Thomas told him to get out, to take his mistress and get off the property. He turned back to me. He said they would liquidate the reserve assets. He promised I would have my money by Monday. I told him I knew I would. I reached into my purse and pulled out a set of keys. The keys to the main house, the guest cottages, the office, the wine cellar, the keys to the cage I had spent 5 years gilding. I dropped them onto the coffee table. They landed with a final, metallic clatter next to the leather-bound book. I said I was done there. I turned and walked toward the door. I didn't look back at the ruin behind me. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what it looked like. I had designed it myself. The walk to my car felt different than any other time I had crossed that gravel driveway. For 5 years, I had walked carefully, worried about making noise, worried about tracking dirt, worried about disturbing the perfect image of the estate. Now, my boots crunched loudly on the stones, and I didn't care who heard. The air felt cleaner, sharper, stripped of the heavy scent of fermentation and lies. I got into my car, not the flashy SUV. Brandon insisted we lease for appearances, but the vintage Volvo I had bought with my first big commission years ago. It was sturdy. It was reliable. It was mine. As I drove through the iron gates, I didn't look back in the rearview mirror. I knew what was happening behind those walls. The lawyers were already being called. The PR team was being summoned to spin a narrative that was unspinnable. Thomas was likely pouring a very expensive drink and calculating the cost of his son's arrogance. But that wasn't my project anymore. The settlement came through 4 days later. The morality clause, in the trust the one Brandon had tried to use against me, was indeed ironclad. Thomas didn't fight. He knew that a public trial would reveal the depths of the financial mismanagement and destroy the brand forever. He chose to amputate the limb to save the body. The wire transfer hit my account on a Tuesday morning. $6 million. It was a number that looked abstract on a screen, a string of zeros that represented freedom. But as I stared at it, I realized something strange. I didn't feel rich. I just felt light. I drove north, away from the valley, toward the coast. I had bought a small plot of land near Mendocino weeks ago, under the same shell company name. It wasn't a vineyard. It wasn't a legacy estate. It was just 10 acres of wild grass and ocean fog. I parked and walked to the edge of the cliff. The wind whipped my hair across my face. I looked at my hands, the hands that had drawn blueprints, hung drapes, and signed checks to keep a sinking ship afloat. For years, I had used my creativity to build someone else's dream, to polish a cage until it looked like a palace. I had convinced myself that if I just built it beautiful enough, they would have to love me. But you can't design your way into being valued by people who only see you as a utility. You can't architect a soul into a hollow house. I pulled the blueprints for my new studio out of my bag. They were rough sketches, charcoal on paper, messy and imperfect. A space for me, a space to create, not to serve. I realized then that the money wasn't the victory. The $6 million was just restitution. The real victory was that I had walked out of that room with my creative soul intact. I hadn't let them break me. I hadn't let them turn me into a bitter, empty shell. I had used their own tools, their greed, their pride, their obsession with optics to dismantle their power over me. I didn't steal their empire. I proved that I was the only one capable of building one from scratch. I looked out at the horizon, where the gray sea met the gray sky. It was a blank canvas, and for the first time in 5 years, I was holding the brush. I walked away with $6 million and my dignity. But tell me, if you held the debt on your cheating spouse, would you have taken the cash or taken the house just to kick them out? Tell me in the comments. And if you believe in building your own empire, hit that share button.